One possible caffeine consuming schedule that works very well, that doesn't fortunately subject you to long 20-day bouts or 5-day or even 2-day bouts of abstinence. And that's the every other day schedule of caffeine. If you look at the half-life of caffeine and you look at its effects on the dopamine system and its performance-enhancing effects and how a period of abstinence can, in fact, increase the performance-enhancing effects of caffeine, but also take into consideration that caffeine can be habit-forming and we can develop a sort of tolerance to caffeine. Well, then what emerges from all of that is that being a person who consumes caffeine every other day can actually help you maximize most of the positive effects of caffeine without subjecting you to the kind of misery that occurs if you're accustomed to consuming caffeine every single day and then suddenly go into a 2 or 5 or 20-day abstinence. So I myself have never tried an every other day caffeine approach, although I'm considering doing it based on the literature that I've read. And I'm considering doing it in a very specific way, which would be to only consume caffeine on the days in which I resistance train. And since I tend to do that about 3 or 4 days per week, organized in a way that's every other day. Again, if you want to see the exercise schedule that I follow, including cardiovascular exercise and weight training, and all the reasons and rationale for what I do, and how it maps onto the scientific literature related to health span and lifespan, vitality, etc., you can find that at hubermanlab.com. And we had a toolkit for fitness that ought to be posted to our website before long. The every other day schedule of caffeine intake, to me, seems like the most rational one if one wants to maximize on the performance-enhancing effects of caffeine without suffering the effects of caffeine withdrawal that are associated with being a regular consumer of caffeine and then stopping caffeine intake, such as headache and irritability and so forth. Not I nor anyone in my life wants me to experience those effects, and I'm sure you don't want to experience those effects for you either. So if you're somebody that decides to try the every other day protocol, or you are somebody who's already doing that protocol, please let me know what your experiences with that are, at least by my read of the literature on caffeine and its performance-enhancing effects, but also the effects of caffeine on neurotransmitter and hormone systems. The every other day caffeine schedule does seem to be the most rational and scientifically grounded one in order to maximize on all those effects. In addition to so-called performance-enhancing effects of caffeine, there are also the well-studied and now fairly well mechanistically understood pro-health effects of caffeine. Now here, when I talk about pro-health effects of caffeine, I want to be very clear that if your schedule of caffeine intake, that is your timing of caffeine intake, or anything else for that matter, offsets getting regular, high-quality sleep of sufficient duration, well, then you are undermining the pro-health effects of that thing. This is true for exercise. This is true for caffeine. This is true for supplementation. This is true for prescription drugs. Again, you don't want to be neurotically attached to the idea that you have to get perfect sleep every night, because that's simply not true. But it is absolutely the case that anything, whether or not it's good for you or bad for you in the short term, that disrupts your sleep because of the timing in which you're doing that thing is going to undermine your immediate and long-term health before long. So with that said, there are several well-described health-promoting effects of caffeine ingestion. And once again, when I say caffeine ingestion, I'm referring to that 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight dosage. There are really nice studies showing that being a regular consumer of caffeine can help offset some of the probability of developing Parkinson's and maybe Alzheimer's related dementia as well. These are not terribly controversial data because of the fact that caffeine is known to increase the release of those catecholamines, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, as well as acetylcholine. All those neurotransmitter and neuromodulator systems are the ones that are known to be defective in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, although there are other transmitter and hormone systems that are defective as well. There are beautiful reviews on the neuroprotective effects of caffeine in neurodegenerative diseases. They're quite extensive, and I'll just refer you to one and the references therein, and we'll provide a link to this in the show note captions. The title, as the topic at hand suggests, is The Neuroprotective Effects of Caffeine in Neurodegenerative Diseases. This was published in 2016. I'm sure there have been other reviews since then, but it includes many, many quality references and studies both in animals and in humans, pointing to the fact that specific enzymes that are associated with the health of, in particular, dopamine neurons are made more robust by regular ingestion of caffeine. It also points to the fact that The increase in dopamine receptors that is induced by regular ingestion of caffeine, that I referred to earlier, is another way in which dopamine, however many dopamine neurons remain around in people with Parkinson's or people who are aging that lose dopamine neurons naturally, that dopamine can have its maximal effect because of the increase in receptors for dopamine that caffeine induces. And there are other biological mechanisms that further support why caffeine ought to be neuroprotective, including its effects on the acetylcholine system, which is one of the major systems disrupted in Alzheimer's dementia. So in other words, it makes perfect sense as to why caffeine would be neuroprotective. Caffeine has also been shown to diminish headache, in particular when taken in combination with aspirin, and that's because of the effects of caffeine and aspirin on blood flow. There's also evidence that caffeine can provide brief but substantial relief from asthma. So I wouldn't want people to rely on caffeine as a life-saving approach to an asthmatic attack. That said, for people that suffer from minor asthma, that caffeine intake, again, of the dosages that we talked about before, has been shown to alleviate some of the major symptoms of asthma for anywhere from 1 to 4 hours. And I know this is of relevance to a lot of people out there, because caffeine increases the catecholamines, and in particular because caffeine increases dopamine transmission in the prefrontal cortex, this area of the brain associated with focus and rule setting and context and task switching. Caffeine is known to improve focus and alertness, in particular in people who have symptoms of ADHD or other attention and focus issues. Now, caffeine alone does not appear to be as potent for the treatment of ADHD as are things like Ritalin, Adderall, modafinil, and armodafinil, and Vyvanse. If you would like a sort of head-by-head comparison of prescription drugs, supplements, and things like caffeine, as well as coverage of behavioral tools and nutritional tools, etc., that can positively offset some of the symptoms of ADHD, please see the episode that I did on ADHD. Again, that's available at hubermanlab.com in all formats. But that said, caffeine does increase focus, and it does it through a number of different mechanisms, not the least of which is to increase dopamine transmission in the forebrain, just as a drug like Ritalin or Adderall would, although not to the same extent as a drug like Ritalin or Adderall does.